King Louis XVI's handling of the French Revolution stands as one of the clearest examples of how indecision and misreading the public mood can spiral into catastrophe. When protests began in 1789, many hoped the monarchy would support moderate reforms, allowing for a constitutional balance between royal power and citizen rights. Instead, Louis hesitated. Faced with financial crisis, rising bread prices, and calls for change from across social classes, he initially gave mixed signals, at times accepting reforms, at other times resisting them under pressure from conservative nobles and advisors. This wavering leadership eroded public trust at a critical moment. Rather than steering the country through reform, Louis attempted to preserve the old order while appearing open to dialogue. When the people stormed the Bastille, it wasn't just a violent outburst. It was a message that faith in royal leadership had collapsed. Still, Louis misjudged the urgency of the situation. He reluctantly accepted the National Assembly and appeared in public wearing revolutionary symbols. But behind closed doors, he plotted with foreign powers to restore absolute rule. The turning point came in 1791, when Louis and his family attempted to flee Paris in disguise, hoping to rally support from monarchs abroad. The plan failed, and their capture shattered any remaining image of a king working in good faith with his people. From that moment, revolutionaries no longer saw Louis as a misguided ruler. They viewed him as a threat. The monarchy, once central to French identity, had become a symbol of betrayal. Over the next year, pressure mounted as France descended into war, factionalism, and growing radicalism. When documents revealed Louis had been secretly corresponding with foreign enemies, public anger boiled over. The decision to continue resisting change not only sealed his own fate, but helped push the revolution into a more violent, unpredictable phase. Had Louis embraced reform early and firmly, history might have remembered him differently. Not as the last king of France's old regime, but as the one who saved it from unraveling. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was intended as a show of dominance, but it became a turning point that shattered his empire's momentum. Frustrated by Tsar Alexander I's refusal to fully enforce the continental system, a trade blockade meant to isolate Britain, Napoleon launched one of the largest military campaigns in history. Over 600,000 troops marched east, an enormous force drawn from across Europe, confident in swift victory. But Russia's vastness, its climate, and the deliberate strategy of retreat left the French army with no decisive battle and no clear path forward. As Napoleon advanced deeper, Russian forces withdrew while burning crops, homes, and towns behind them. This scorched earth tactic denied the invaders supplies and shelter, forcing them to rely on long, fragile supply lines. When the two armies finally clashed at Borodino near Moscow, the battle was staggering in its scale, but inconclusive in result. Napoleon captured Moscow, but the city was largely abandoned and soon engulfed in flames. With winter approaching and no sign of a Russian surrender, Napoleon faced a grim choice: remain in a ruined city with no supplies, or begin the long retreat. He chose to leave. The withdrawal began under increasingly brutal conditions. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion turned the retreat into a nightmare. Russian cavalry and guerrilla fighters harassed the rear, and bridges across rivers collapsed under the weight of desperate soldiers. Horses fell in snowdrifts, men froze during the night, and entire units simply vanished. The army that had once been a symbol of imperial might returned to France as a shattered remnant, barely a tenth of its original size. The failure of the Russian campaign destroyed Napoleon's aura of invincibility. Allies who had once feared or respected him began to question his judgment and form new coalitions. Within 2 years, he would be forced to abdicate for the first time. What was meant to be a demonstration of imperial strength became the most infamous miscalculation of his career, one that exposed the limits of ambition unchecked by logistics or local knowledge. The Russian winter didn't defeat Napoleon alone. It only finished what poor planning and stubborn pride had begun.
Leopold II's decision to turn the Congo into his personal colony stands as one of the darkest examples of unchecked authority in modern history. In the late 19th century, as European powers scrambled for influence in Africa, Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian. He claimed his intentions in the Congo were to bring civilization, combat slavery, and promote free trade. Behind this facade, however, was a carefully constructed system of forced labor, exploitation, and violence that turned a vast region into a brutal economic engine for one man's private fortune. Under the guise of the Congo Free State, Leopold established a regime that operated outside Belgium's official control, with him as its sole owner. The region's rich rubber and ivory resources were extracted through terror. Villages were required to meet rubber quotas, and failure to do so resulted in severe punishment. Armed enforcers, often recruited from one group to control another, imposed these quotas with rifles and whips. In some areas, hostages were taken to ensure compliance. What made the situation even more disturbing was the secrecy surrounding it. Reports were suppressed, and few outsiders truly understood what was happening deep in the interior. But over time, missionaries, journalists, and diplomats began to document the horrors. The most famous among them, Edmund Dean Morel and Roger Casement, gathered evidence and launched an international campaign to expose the truth. Their findings shocked Europe. Photos and first-hand testimonies painted a picture of industrial-scale suffering, one carried out in the name of progress. Faced with mounting pressure, Leopold was eventually forced to relinquish control in 1908. The Belgian government took over, though the wounds left by his rule would linger for generations. Estimates vary, but millions are believed to have lost their lives during his reign. The Congo Free State became a case study in how imperialism, masked by idealism, could produce some of the worst atrocities of the modern era. Leopold had promised light to a dark continent. What he brought instead was a system so cruel it shattered the illusion that colonization could ever be purely benevolent.
Kaiser Wilhelm II's choices in the years leading up to World War I played a central role in transforming a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. His reign, beginning in 1888, was marked by ambition and unpredictability. He dismissed the cautious diplomacy of his predecessor, Otto von Bismarck, and instead pursued a more aggressive foreign policy known as Weltpolitik, a vision of Germany as a global power with overseas colonies and a navy to rival Britain's. But this ambition was not matched by careful planning. Wilhelm often spoke impulsively and alienated allies with mixed messages and grandiose statements. Tensions in Europe were already high, with rival alliances forming and national rivalries growing. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, it created a volatile moment that might still have been diffused. Instead, Wilhelm offered Austria-Hungary a sweeping guarantee of support, a so-called blank check. This emboldened Vienna to take a hard line against Serbia, triggering a chain reaction. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia, and France was pulled in through its alliance with Russia. Within days, Europe was engulfed. Even as the situation spiraled, Wilhelm failed to grasp its full danger. He vacillated between supporting military action and seeking peace, often too late to make a difference. He placed enormous faith in speed and surprise, convinced that Germany could win quickly before other powers fully mobilized. But the Schlieffen-Krieg, Germany's blueprint for war, depended on invading neutral Belgium, bringing Britain into the conflict. What was meant to be a short, decisive campaign became a grinding, years-long war that dragged the world into chaos. By 1918, Germany was exhausted. The Kaiser had become a figurehead, sidelined by generals and increasingly detached from reality. He eventually abdicated and went into exile, a broken symbol of a shattered empire. The First World War redrew borders, ended empires, and left tens of millions wounded, displaced, or gone.
While many factors led to the war, Wilhelm's failure to manage alliances, his reckless diplomacy, and his inability to foresee the consequences of escalation place him at the center of a tragedy that reshaped the 20th century.
Nicholas II's handling of World War I and the events leading up to the Russian Revolution reveal the ruler deeply out of step with the era he lived in. As the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, he inherited an empire already struggling with inequality, unrest, and the slow pace of modernization. Instead of addressing these challenges with reform, he clung to autocracy, believing that absolute power was both his right and duty. When war broke out in 1914, Nicholas saw it as a chance to unite his people through patriotism. But rather than bringing stability, the war exposed every weakness of his leadership and his regime. Russia entered the conflict with enthusiasm, but its army was poorly equipped and badly organized. As defeats piled up and casualties soared, public confidence began to erode. In a critical move, Nicholas took personal command of the military in 1915, despite having no real experience as a commander. This decision backfired. Not only did it tie him directly to every battlefield failure, but it also left the government in the hands of his unpopular wife, Alexandra, and her inner circle, including the mystic Rasputin, whose influence became a source of scandal and suspicion. Back in the cities, food shortages, inflation, and strikes crippled daily life. The divide between the imperial court and ordinary Russians grew wider with each passing month. When protests erupted in Petrograd in early 1917, Nicholas underestimated their seriousness. He ordered troops to restore order, but many soldiers refused to fire on the crowds and joined the demonstrators instead. Within days, his authority collapsed. Facing pressure from military and political leaders, Nicholas agreed to step down, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. What followed was chaos. The temporary government that replaced him struggled to hold power, while more radical forces gained momentum. Later that year, the Bolsheviks seized control, plunging the country into civil war and setting the stage for the rise of a new kind of authoritarian state. Nicholas's failure to adapt, to delegate wisely, or to recognize the scale of the crisis left Russia vulnerable to total collapse. In trying to preserve the old order through rigid control, he accelerated its downfall and ushered in a revolution that would change the global balance of power for generations.
Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler is often remembered as one of the most infamous diplomatic miscalculations of the 20th century. In the late 1930s, Europe was still haunted by the trauma of World War I. The idea of another large-scale conflict was unthinkable to many, especially in Britain and France. Chamberlain, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, believed that by meeting Hitler's demands through negotiation, war could be avoided altogether. His approach was rooted in caution, but also in a dangerous misreading of Hitler's intentions. The crisis centered around the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant ethnic German population. Hitler insisted that the area should be part of Germany, claiming it was about unifying the German people. Instead of standing firm with Czechoslovakia, a sovereign nation, Chamberlain flew to Germany to negotiate directly. The result was the Munich Agreement of 1938, in which Britain and France allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland without consulting the Czechs themselves. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming he had secured peace for our time, believing he had averted disaster. In reality, the Munich Agreement only emboldened Hitler. By conceding to his demands, the Western powers demonstrated that they were unwilling to enforce international agreements if it meant risking confrontation. Within months, Germany violated its promises, occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia and preparing for further expansion. By the time Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, triggering the start of World War II, it was clear that appeasement had failed not just as a policy, but as a strategy grounded in wishful thinking rather than clear-eyed analysis. Chamberlain's motivations were not entirely naive.
Britain was unprepared for war, and public opinion strongly favored peace. But by underestimating Hitler's ambitions and failing to draw firm lines early, he allowed Germany to grow stronger and more aggressive without consequence. The legacy of appeasement would haunt European leaders for decades, becoming a cautionary tale about the costs of avoiding conflict at the expense of principle. Chamberlain's decision, intended to preserve stability, instead gave tyranny more room to maneuver, and the price paid would be measured in years of war and immense human suffering.
Tojo Hideki's decision to approve the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was a bold gamble that ultimately sealed Japan's path toward devastating defeat. As prime minister and military leader, Tojo faced immense pressure. Japan had been expanding aggressively across East Asia and the Pacific, occupying parts of China and seeking dominance in the region. But that expansion came at a cost. International sanctions, especially from the United States, had cut off access to vital resources like oil and rubber. Faced with the prospect of economic strangulation, Tojo and his advisors believed that decisive military action could secure the empire's future. The plan was built on speed and surprise. By striking the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan hoped to cripple American naval power before it could respond. At the same time, Japanese forces launched simultaneous offensives across Southeast Asia, targeting the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The goal was to create a vast defensive perimeter and force the Allies into a negotiated settlement that would leave Japan's new empire intact. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meticulously planned, and in the short term, it achieved its objective. American battleships were sunk, airfields were destroyed, and thousands of lives were lost. But Tojo and his advisors miscalculated the response. Instead of intimidating the United States into neutrality, the strike galvanized American resolve. The following day, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and just days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. as well. What had begun as a regional strategy exploded into a truly global conflict. Far from knocking out its opponents, Japan had awakened an industrial and military giant. As the war progressed, Japan struggled to hold its sprawling territories. Key defeats at Midway, Guadalcanal, and eventually across the Pacific Islands revealed the limits of its military power. By 1945, American bombers were devastating Japanese cities, and the country faced overwhelming pressure. Tojo's decision to strike first had failed to account for the long-term consequences. Instead of securing resources and regional dominance, it led to occupation, widespread destruction, and a complete loss of imperial status. After the war, Tojo was held responsible for his role in launching unprovoked aggression. His belief in a quick, calculated blow to alter history had underestimated his enemy's capacity and overestimated his own country's endurance. The attack on Pearl Harbor remains a symbol of strategic overreach, where initial success masked a deeper failure to understand the forces that would soon reshape the world.
Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was one of the most consequential and ultimately self-destructive choices in modern history. At the time, Nazi Germany had already swept through much of Western Europe, and Hitler believed the Soviet Union would be just another quick conquest. He imagined a lightning-fast campaign that would collapse Soviet resistance in a matter of weeks. Instead, he initiated a war so vast and brutal that it would stretch the limits of Germany's military power and lead to staggering losses on both sides. The invasion began with massive force. Over 3 million German troops surged across a 1,000-mile front, supported by tanks, aircraft, and mechanized divisions. Stalin's government was caught off guard, and Soviet forces initially reeled under the assault. Cities fell, prisoners were taken in the hundreds of thousands, and it seemed for a moment that Hitler's vision of victory might be realized. But geography, logistics, and Soviet resilience soon changed the equation. The sheer size of the Soviet Union made rapid conquest impossible. Supply lines grew thin, vehicles broke down, and soldiers faced harsh terrain and unpredictable weather. By the time the Germans neared Moscow, the advance had slowed dramatically. A brutal winter set in, and German troops, unprepared for the conditions, began to suffer frostbite, exhaustion, and shortages. The Soviets, meanwhile, had relocated factories, mobilized reserves, and stiffened their defense. Counteroffensives pushed the Germans back from the capital. What Hitler had thought would be a swift triumph had turned into a grinding war of attrition. Still, he refused to adjust his plans, believing in total victory no matter the cost. As the years dragged on, the Eastern Front consumed resources and manpower at an unsustainable rate. Key defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk marked turning points. The Soviet Union, once underestimated, became the central force that would eventually push all the way to Berlin. Hitler's decision to attack not only failed to bring about the quick domination he envisioned, it opened a second front that drained Germany's strength and exposed it to overwhelming opposition from both East and West. The invasion of the Soviet Union was more than a military blunder. It was driven by ideology, arrogance, and a refusal to respect the limits of strategy and endurance. In reaching for total domination, Hitler had unleashed forces that he could neither control nor survive. The consequences would reshape Europe and end in complete collapse for the regime he had built.
Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, was one of the most ambitious and disastrous policy decisions of the 20th century. Determined to transform China from a largely agrarian society into a modern industrial power almost overnight, Mao introduced sweeping changes that aimed to collectivize agriculture, expand steel production, and eliminate traditional economic structures. What followed was not a leap forward, but a national crisis that would leave lasting scars on the country's development and society. The plan called for the consolidation of small farms into vast communal units where villagers worked and lived together under state supervision. Private ownership was abolished, and productivity was supposed to increase through collective labor and ideological enthusiasm. At the same time, Mao encouraged backyard furnaces across the countryside to boost steel output, believing that industrial progress could come from mass mobilization rather than technical expertise. Local officials, under pressure to meet impossible targets, inflated production figures, hid failures, and forced workers into projects that were often unproductive or destructive. One of the most devastating aspects was the breakdown of the food system. With unrealistic quotas and false reports of surplus, grain was taken from rural areas and diverted to cities or exported abroad. Meanwhile, local populations went hungry. Mismanagement, combined with natural disasters and political repression, led to widespread suffering. Open criticism of the plan was considered disloyal, so problems were concealed rather than corrected. As a result, relief efforts were delayed or ineffective. By the early 1960s, the consequences were undeniable. Agricultural output had collapsed, and millions across the countryside faced severe hardship. The official end of the Great Leap Forward was quietly declared, and policies began to shift, but the human cost remained immeasurable. Estimates vary, but historians widely agree that tens of millions were lost during this period, making it one of the most far-reaching man-made disasters in history. Mao's insistence on ideological purity over practical reality had turned a vision of progress into a nightmare of scarcity and fear. The Great Leap Forward revealed the dangers of unchecked authority, where political loyalty outweighed truth, and mass campaigns were treated as substitutes for sound governance. It also planted the seeds of skepticism among future Chinese leaders, many of whom would later approach reform with far more caution and pragmatism.
Fidel Castro's decision to allow Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil in 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear conflict than ever before. Just a few years after the Cuban Revolution, Castro's new government found itself isolated and threatened. The United States had severed diplomatic ties, imposed economic sanctions, and backed failed efforts like the Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow the regime. Facing a powerful adversary just 90 miles away, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support, not only economic and military aid, but also strategic protection. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev proposed placing medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba to deter further American aggression. For Castro, the offer was appealing. It would demonstrate Cuba's strength, deter invasion, and bind the island more tightly to the Soviet bloc. But the secrecy and speed with which the missiles were installed underestimated how the United States would respond once the presence of nuclear weapons was discovered. When American spy planes captured photographic evidence of the missile sites, it triggered an immediate and intense crisis in Washington. President John F. Kennedy demanded their removal and ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent further deliveries. The world held its breath as the U.S. and the USSR teetered on the edge of direct confrontation. In back-channel negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis was diffused, but not without consequences. For Castro, the resolution was both a relief and a disappointment. He had not been consulted in the final agreement and felt sidelined by both superpowers. The revelation that nuclear weapons had been placed in Cuba without public transparency and in violation of earlier pledges damaged international trust and heightened Cold War tensions for years to come. Within Cuba, the crisis reinforced the country's dependence on Soviet support while deepening its isolation from the Western Hemisphere. In hindsight, accepting the missiles had short-term strategic logic, but immense long-term risks. The gamble nearly sparked a global disaster, and although conflict was avoided, it confirmed to many that smaller nations entangled in superpower rivalries could be used as pawns in much larger games. Castro's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis remains a vivid example of how strategic decisions made under pressure can place an entire world on the edge of irreversible consequences.
Mikhail Gorbachev's introduction of perestroika and glasnost in the 1980s was intended to modernize the Soviet Union and save its crumbling system, but instead it hastened its collapse. By the time Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, the USSR was economically stagnant, burdened by a massive military budget, and deeply out of touch with the needs of its citizens. Recognizing the urgent need for change, Gorbachev launched a bold reform program. Perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to decentralize economic control and encourage limited market mechanisms. Glasnost, or openness, promoted greater transparency in government, freer expression, and a more honest reckoning with the country's past. At first, the changes were welcomed. After decades of secrecy, people could finally speak more freely, criticize officials, and learn about events that had been suppressed for generations. But with this new openness came rising expectations and a flood of long-held grievances. Nationalist movements in the Baltic republics, Ukraine, and the Caucasus began to demand autonomy, while economic reforms failed to deliver quick results. Shortages continued, inflation soared, and the black market flourished. Gorbachev's reluctance to implement full-scale market reforms left the economy stuck between central planning and free enterprise, pleasing neither camp. Politically, the once monolithic Communist Party began to fracture. Glasnost had unleashed debates that could not be easily contained. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster, initially hidden from the public, became a symbol of everything Glasnost was supposed to correct, but also highlighted the deep rot within Soviet institutions. As more information came to light, public trust in the system continued to erode. Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together through careful compromises, but the pace of change had moved beyond his control. By 1991, the situation had spiraled. A failed coup by hardliners only accelerated the USSR's disintegration. Republic after republic declared independence, and the USSR officially dissolved by the end of the year. Gorbachev, once hailed as a reformer, left office with no country to govern. While he is remembered positively in many parts of the world for ending the Cold War and promoting democratic ideals, within Russia, opinions remain mixed. His attempt to modernize from within inadvertently revealed just how fragile the foundation truly was. Rather than guiding the Soviet Union into a new era, Gorbachev's reforms exposed its deep contradictions and broke the seal on decades of suppressed demands. What was meant to save the system instead became the final act of one of the 20th century's defining empires.
George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003 was framed as a preemptive strike to eliminate weapons of mass destruction and remove a dangerous dictator. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the United States was gripped by fear and a sense of urgency. The Bush administration argued that Saddam Hussein posed an immediate threat not only to the region, but to global security. Intelligence agencies pointed to supposed stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, alleged ties to terrorist groups, and a pattern of defiance toward international law. The case was forceful, but ultimately flawed. The invasion began with a rapid military campaign that quickly toppled Saddam's regime. Baghdad fell within weeks, and images of statues being pulled down were broadcast around the world. But the success on the battlefield masked the absence of a clear post-war strategy. As U.S. forces searched for weapons that didn't exist, it became increasingly evident that the central justification for the war was based on inaccurate or misrepresented intelligence. No weapons of mass destruction were found, and the link between Saddam's government and extremist groups remained unproven. The occupation that followed proved far more difficult than expected. Iraq's military and civil institutions were dismantled almost overnight, leaving a power vacuum. Insurgency, sectarian violence, and political chaos filled the void. American and coalition troops found themselves in a prolonged conflict with no easy exit as suicide bombings, militias, and foreign fighters turned Iraq into a battlefield of competing interests. The cost in human lives, both Iraqi and American, mounted year after year, while trillions of dollars were spent with little to show in terms of lasting stability. Politically, the war damaged America's global reputation. It strained alliances, fueled anti-Western sentiment, and shifted focus away from the broader fight against terrorism. The conflict also reshaped the Middle East. The power vacuum left behind allowed extremist groups to gain traction, culminating years later in the rise of ISIS. What had begun as an effort to bring democracy to a troubled region ended up destabilizing it further. Years later, inquiries and investigations acknowledged that the intelligence was flawed and that the war had been a strategic misstep. For many, it remains a defining example of how fear, pressure, and ideological certainty can lead to far-reaching decisions without adequate preparation for the consequences. Bush's choice to invade Iraq may have removed a dictator, but it also unleashed a chain of events whose impact is still being felt across the world today.